Welcome to this deep dive, and today we are cracking open a fascinating chapter of history. Well, more accurately, a chapter of the King James Bible, Leviticus Chapter 11. Now, we're not diving into the whole book, just this specific chapter that lays out some pretty intriguing dietary laws for the ancient Israelites.
It's fascinating how food, even thousands of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
played such a central role, not just in sustenance, but also in shaping cultural and religious practices.
Exactly. And for anyone who's picturing dusty scrolls and fire and brimstone sermons, trust me, this is way more interesting than you might think. We're talking cloven hooves, cud chewing, and some creatures that might leave you scratching your head, wondering what the ancient Israelites were thinking.
Well, remember, these laws weren't arbitrary. They were deeply embedded in their belief system and offered a way to connect with the divine.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Leviticus chapter 11 breaks down what's considered clean to eat and what's unclean for the Israelites. We're not just talking about washing your hands before dinner. This was a whole system of ritual purity.
Right. It was about separating themselves from what they considered profane
Yeah.
and aligning themselves with the sacred. And those ideas extended to the very food they consumed.
So let's start with the land animals. Leviticus lays out a seemingly simple rule. If it chews the cud and has cloven hooves, it's on the menu. Cows, sheep, goats, those are all good. But pigs, nope. Cloven hooves, but no cud chewing, so off the menu they go.
It's interesting to consider the implications of that, isn't it? Pigs were a common food source for many neighboring cultures. So this prohibition might have been a way for the Israelites to distinguish themselves, to create a sense of cultural and religious identity.
It's like a culinary boundary line saying, this is who we are and this is what sets us apart. But I'm curious, do we know if there were any specific reasons? Beyond ritual purity, why certain animals were deemed unclean? For example, was there a practical element to it, like avoiding animals that were known to carry diseases?
There's definitely a theory that some of the rules might have been linked to health and sanitation, especially in a time before refrigeration. However, the text itself emphasizes the ritual aspect, focusing on concepts of holiness and purity, rather than hygiene.
Okay, so it's more about the symbolic meaning than the practical implications. And speaking of symbolism, let's dive into the sea creatures. The rule here is a bit more straightforward. If it has fins and scales, you're good to go.
Which means your salmon and trout are approved, but shellfish lovers would be out of luck. Lobster, shrimp, crab, all considered unclean.
I can already hear some of our listeners groaning at that thought. Now, shellfish can spoil quickly, especially in warm climates. So was this rule also about food safety?
It's certainly possible that practical considerations played a role, but again, the text focuses primarily on the ritual aspect. Shellfish, being bottom dwellers, might have been seen as being closer to the unclean realm of the seafloor, as opposed to fish that swim freely in the water.
Interesting. So it's not just about the physical characteristics of the animal, but also its place in the natural order. Okay, we've covered land and sea. Let's take flight now and talk about the birds. This is where things get a little more, well, specific.
Yes, Leviticus provides a whole list of forbidden birds, some of which are only identified by their ancient names, making it tricky to pinpoint exactly which species they were referring to.
So we've got eagles, owls, vultures, all considered unclean. Are we seeing any patterns here?
Well, many of the birds on the forbidden list are birds of prey or scavengers, birds that feed on carrion, or they hunt other animals, might have been seen as embodying a kind of wildness or impurity that the Israelites were meant to avoid.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to be seen as aligning yourself with those characteristics. But what about birds that seem relatively harmless, like swans? They're on the forbidden list too.
That one is a bit more puzzling, but some scholars speculate that it might have been due to their association with water, which, in certain contexts, held symbolic connections to the underworld, or the realm of chaos.
Okay, so even seemingly innocent creatures could carry symbolic baggage. Fascinating. But hold on, we haven't even talked about the creepy crawlies yet. Leviticus doesn't hold back on those either.
Most land-crawling creatures are deemed unclean. Weasels, mice, lizards, snails, the list goes on.
But there's an exception, right? Not all creepy crawlies are off the menu.
You're right. Locusts, beetles, and grasshoppers are considered perfectly acceptable. In fact, they're even mentioned as a potential food source during times of famine.
Okay. I can see some of our listeners squirming at that thought. But it's a great reminder that what we consider edible or disgusting is very much shaped by our culture and upbringing.
Precisely. And this is a great example of how these dietary laws weren't just abstract concepts. They had real-world implications for how people lived and what they ate.
So it wasn't just about avoiding certain animals. It was about embodying a whole way of life, a way of separating oneself from the profane and aligning oneself with the sacred.
Exactly. And that concept of ritual purity extended beyond just the act of eating. Even touching the carcass of an unclean animal could make you ritually impure.
Wow. So it was a whole system of avoidance and purification.
And this system was deeply ingrained in their daily lives. Imagine you're an Israelite living in ancient times. You're invited to a feast. But you have to be mindful of what's being served. You can't just dig in without considering the source of the food and whether it aligns with the laws you're obligated to follow.
That's a whole different level of dietary awareness than most of us have today. It makes you wonder how they navigated those social situations and how these laws impacted their relationships with those who didn't follow the same rules.
That's a great point. And that's actually something we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive, as we delve into the cultural and historical context of these laws and how they played out in everyday life.
I'm already intrigued, but before we move on, I think it's important to highlight that we're not presenting these dietary laws as something to be adopted or judged by modern standards.
Absolutely. We're simply exploring them as a fascinating window into the beliefs and practices of a different time and culture.
And in doing so, we might even discover some unexpected insights into our own relationship with food and the stories we tell ourselves about what we eat.
Exactly. So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the world of ancient dietary laws and uncover the surprising ways they continue to resonate even today.
All right, so we've delved into the specifics of these ancient dietary laws, exploring which animals were deemed clean and unclean in the eyes of the ancient Israelites. But I'm curious about how these ideas spread beyond ancient Israel, and if they influenced other cultures and belief systems. Did these dietary practices stay confined to that time and place, or did they have a wider impact?
That's a great question, and it speaks to the fascinating way ideas, especially those related to food and ritual, can travel across time and cultures. And in the case of these dietary laws, we see their influence rippling outward, shaping the development of other faiths and traditions.
Okay, so we're going beyond the Bible now. I'm ready to trace these culinary connections across history. Where do we start?
Well, let's consider early Christianity as a faith that emerged from Judaism. Early Christians grappled with the question of whether these dietary laws should still apply to Gentile converts. Should those who weren't Jewish by birth also be bound by these same restrictions?
That's a fascinating question. Was there a push to make those laws universal for all Christians, or was there more flexibility in how they were interpreted?
It was a major point of debate in the early church. Some argued for maintaining those laws, seeing them as essential for spiritual purity, while others advocated for a more inclusive approach, emphasizing that salvation came through faith in Jesus, not through adherence to specific dietary regulations.
So did they settle on a universal menu for all Christians, or was it more of a choose-your-own-adventure situation?
It was a complex process, marked by theological discussions and evolving interpretations, but ultimately, the early church leaders decided to move away. From many of the strict dietary restrictions of the Old Testament, they shifted the focus to broader principles, like avoiding food offered to idols, and emphasizing love and charity over strict adherence to specific rules.
It sounds like they were striving to find a balance between honoring tradition and creating a more accessible and inclusive faith.
Exactly. But while those specific regulations were loosened, the underlying concepts of clean and unclean foods didn't vanish entirely. They continued to influence Christian thought and practice, taking on different forms and interpretations in various denominations.
So even though the strict adherence to those specific rules faded, the echoes of those ideas continued to resonate. That's a powerful testament to the enduring impact of these concepts. And were there other religions that were influenced by these ideas?
Absolutely. Centuries later, when Islam emerged, it also incorporated dietary laws that bear some similarities to those found in Leviticus. The prohibition against eating pork, for example, is a central tenet of both Jewish and Islamic dietary practices.
So we're seeing these ancient ideas about food and purity, crossing cultural and religious boundaries, weaving their way into the fabric of various belief systems. It makes you wonder, what is it about food that makes it so central to so many different religions?
That's a profound observation. I think it speaks to the fact that food is more than just sustenance. It's an act that's deeply embedded in our daily lives, in our social interactions, and in our understanding of the world around us. It's no wonder that religions throughout history have incorporated food into their rituals and belief systems.
It's like every time we eat, we're not just consuming calories, we're participating in a story that stretches back thousands of years.
Precisely. Food becomes a powerful symbol, a way of connecting with something larger than ourselves, whether it's our community, our history, or our sense of the sacred.
Okay, so we've talked about the ripple effect of these dietary laws and how they influenced other religions. But let's zoom back in on ancient Israel for a moment. I'm curious about the how of these laws. How did they actually play out in everyday life? Did people walk around with copies of Leviticus, double-checking if they were allowed to eat that particular locust or not?
Well, it's unlikely that everyone had a personal scroll of Leviticus on hand, but the knowledge of these laws would have been passed down through generations, woven into the fabric of their culture.
So it wasn't just about rote memorization of a list of rules. It was about absorbing a whole worldview, a way of understanding their place in the world and their relationship with the divine.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these laws weren't just abstract theological concepts. They had real-world implications. Imagine you're an Israelite living in ancient times. You're invited to a feast, but you can't just indulge in every dish without considering its source.
It sounds like a lot of pressure. Did they have food inspectors going around, ensuring everything was up to code?
Not exactly. But there were likely designated individuals within the community, often religious leaders, who possessed a deep understanding of the dietary laws and could provide guidance in more complex situations.
So if someone came across a new type of fish, they could consult with these experts to determine whether it was kosher or not.
Exactly. And those interpretations could evolve over time as new situations arose and new foods were introduced.
It wasn't just a static set of rules, but a living tradition that adapted to changing circumstances. And how did these laws shape their relationships with those who didn't follow the same rules?
That's a great question, and it speaks to the complexities of navigating cultural and religious differences. These dietary laws likely played a role in shaping the Israelites' sense of identity and their interactions with neighboring cultures.
So it wasn't just about personal piety, it was also about maintaining a distinction, a sense of separation from those who didn't share their beliefs.
Precisely. It was a way of preserving their cultural and religious heritage in a world where they were often surrounded by people with different practices.
Okay, so far we've talked a lot about the why behind these dietary laws. But what about the how? How did these rules actually get implemented in everyday life?
Well, think of it like a complex web of cultural norms and traditions that permeated every aspect of their lives. These laws weren't just about food, they were about embodying a way of life, a way of expressing their devotion to God and their commitment to their community.
It sounds like these laws were deeply integrated into the fabric of their society, shaping everything from their daily meals to their social interactions.
Exactly. And while we might not be bound by the same specific regulations today, there's still a lot we can learn from these ancient practices. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore what these ancient laws might teach us about our own relationship with food in the modern world.
We've journeyed through ancient dietary laws, from cloven hooves to forbidden birds, and even traced their influence across cultures and religions. But now I'm curious about how this ancient wisdom might resonate with us today. Thousands of years later, in a world of supermarkets and fast food, what can we learn from these ancient rules about our own relationship with food?
It's fascinating to consider how these practices, rooted in a very different time and context, might still hold relevance for us today. While we might not be bound by the same specific regulations, I think there are some valuable insights we can glean from this ancient approach to food.
Okay, I'm all ears. What wisdom can we mine from these dietary laws of yore?
Well, for one, they highlight the power of intentionality. The Israelites didn't just eat whatever was readily available. They made conscious choices about what they consumed, guided by a deeper set of beliefs and values.
It was less about following a rigid set of rules and more about aligning their actions with their core beliefs. It sounds almost like a form of mindful eating, but centuries before it became a buzzword.
Exactly. And in today's world, where we're bombarded with food choices and often eat on autopilot, that kind of intentionality is more important than ever.
It's so easy to get caught up in the convenience and abundance of modern food culture, grabbing whatever's quick and easy without really considering the source or the impact of our choices.
Right. So perhaps we can take a cue from these ancient practices and ask ourselves, what are the values that guide our own food choices? Are we eating in a way that aligns with our personal beliefs about health, sustainability, or ethical treatment of animals?
Those are big questions. But I think you're right. It's worth taking the time to reflect on those things. It's not about adopting a strict set of rules, but about bringing more awareness and intention to our relationship with food.
Absolutely. It's about making choices that resonate with our values and contribute to our overall well-being, and beyond individual choices. These ancient laws also emphasize the importance of community and shared meals. The Israelites' dietary practices weren't just about personal piety, they were about strengthening social bonds and creating a sense of belonging.
Right. We talked about how those shared meals, with their specific rules and rituals, helped reinforce their identity as a people and deepen their connection to each other.
Exactly. And in our modern world, where individualism is often prized, and meals are frequently rushed or solitary affairs, I think there's something powerful about reclaiming the communal aspect of food.
Totally. There's a special kind of magic that happens when we gather around a table with loved ones,
Yeah.
sharing food and stories, and nourishing not just our bodies, but our souls as well.
And it doesn't have to be a fancy or elaborate affair. It's about creating space for connection and presence, even amidst the busyness of modern life.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the most powerful takeaway for me is this idea that food is more than just fuel for our bodies. It's a reflection of our values, our history, and our connection to something larger than ourselves.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Even though we live in a vastly different world
Yeah.
than the ancient Israelites, their approach to food offers valuable lessons about intentionality, community,
Mhm.
and the sacredness of nourishment.
What a fascinating journey this has been. It's amazing to see how exploring ancient traditions can illuminate our own lives and inspire us to approach food with more mindfulness, gratitude, and connection.
Indeed. So as you go about your day, I encourage you to pause and consider your own relationship with food. What stories shape your choices? What rituals bring you joy and connection? And how can you use food as a way to nourish not just your body, but also your spirit and the world around you?
What a beautiful and thought-provoking way to end our deep dive. To our listeners, we hope this exploration has sparked your curiosity and perhaps even inspired you to approach your next meal with a renewed sense of wonder and appreciation. Until next time, keep diving deep and bon appétit.